Good evening and welcome to the Drowsy Economist. I'm glad you found your way here tonight. This channel exists at the intersection of learning and rest, a place where the often overwhelming world of finance and economics is transformed into something gentle, something soothing, something that allows your mind to wander and settle as you drift towards sleep. Over the next hour and a half or so, we'll explore inflation together, not with urgency or excitement, but with the kind of measured, deliberate pace that invites relaxation. If you find yourself learning something along the way, wonderful. If instead you find yourself drifting off into peaceful sleep, that's wonderful too. There's no wrong way to experience this content. Before we begin, if you enjoy this format, these long, calm explorations of financial topics, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like. It helps others discover this quiet corner of the internet. And now, let us turn our attention to inflation itself and the quiet, persistent way it shapes the world around us. You've noticed it, of course. Perhaps not all at once, and perhaps not with any particular alarm, but you've noticed it nonetheless. The price of things. The way a gallon of milk costs a bit more than it used to. The way your rent has crept upward, year after year, in increments that feel small individually, but accumulate into something substantial. The way a tank of gas, a loaf of bread, a cup of coffee, all these ordinary purchases that make up daily life, require a few more dollars than they did some years ago. This is not a crisis. It is not an emergency. It is simply something that happens slowly and steadily across time. Prices rise. Money buys a little less than it once did. And this gradual, almost imperceptible shift is what we call inflation. But before we define it formally, before we discuss how it's measured or why it occurs, let us simply sit with the experience of it. Let us think about what it feels like to live in a world where prices tend to drift upward, where the cost of things 5 years ago seems quaint, almost nostalgic, when remembered today. Think back, if you will, to a purchase you made some years ago. Perhaps it was a car, perhaps it was a home, perhaps it was something smaller, a television, a computer, a winter coat. Do you remember what you paid? And do you remember at the time whether that price seemed reasonable or perhaps even expensive? Now consider what that same item would cost today. Not a newer version with better features, but the same item, if you could somehow purchase it again at today's prices. The difference between those two numbers, the price then and the price now, that difference is, in part, the effect of inflation. Or think about your first job, your first paycheck. Do you remember the hourly wage or the annual salary? It might have seemed adequate at the time, enough to cover rent and food and the occasional small luxury. But that same amount today would buy less. Not because the money itself has changed in any physical way. A dollar bill from 20 years ago looks much the same as a dollar bill printed yesterday, but because the relationship between money and goods has shifted. Each dollar now commands a smaller portion of the economy's output. This is the essential character of inflation. It is not loud or dramatic. It does not announce itself. It simply proceeds year after year, shifting the numbers on price tags and menus and rent agreements, altering the relationship between the money we hold and the things that money can purchase. Consider the grocery store. You walk the same aisles you've walked for years. The layout is familiar. The products are familiar. But the prices, if you pay attention, have changed. A box of cereal that once cost $3 now costs $4. A pound of chicken that was $5 is now $6 or $7. These increases happen gradually, one at a time, often separated by months or years so that no single change feels particularly significant. But cumulatively, over time, the total cost of filling your cart has risen. You adapt, of course. Perhaps you buy a different brand, or wait for sales, or adjust your purchases in small ways. Perhaps you don't think about it much at all. The change is slow enough that it blends into the background of daily life, one more thing to navigate without much conscious thought. Or consider housing. Whether you rent or own, you've likely seen costs increase. If you rent, your landlord may raise the rent each year, sometimes by a fixed percentage, sometimes by an amount that feels arbitrary but is nonetheless accepted because finding a new place would be more disruptive than paying a bit more. If you own, your mortgage payment may be fixed, but property taxes rise, insurance premiums increase, maintenance costs grow. The shelter you need, the space you inhabit, becomes more expensive over time. And then there is fuel. The price of gasoline fluctuates, sometimes dramatically, responding to events distant and complex. But if you look past the short-term volatility, past the sudden spikes and drops, you see a broader trend. The average price of fuel today is higher than it was 10 years ago, which was higher than it was 20 years ago. The same tank of gas costs more dollars to fill. These are not abstract economic phenomena. They are experiences, small, everyday observations that accumulate into a pattern. You notice them, or perhaps you don't. You adjust, or perhaps you simply accept. But they are there, persistent and undeniable, shaping the way you interact with the economy around you. Now, it's worth noting that not all prices rise at the same rate. Some things become more expensive quickly, others barely change at all. And some things, particularly technology, actually become cheaper over time, even as general inflation continues. A computer today is far more powerful than a computer from 15 years ago, and yet it costs less in nominal dollars. A television is larger, sharper, more capable, and yet cheaper. This is not a contradiction to inflation, but a reminder that inflation describes a general tendency, an average across many goods and services, not a universal rule that applies to every individual item. But the general tendency, the average, does tend upward. Over the course of years and decades, the typical basket of goods and services a person might purchase costs more. And this means that money itself, in a sense, loses value. Not in any physical way, the paper and ink remain the same, but in terms of what that money can accomplish, what it can buy, what it can command in the marketplace. Some people find this troubling. The idea that money saved today will be worth less tomorrow creates a kind of unease, a sense that the ground is shifting beneath one's feet. Others accept it as simply the way things work, a feature of modern economies, neither good nor bad, but merely present. And still others benefit from it, particularly those who owe money, because debts fixed in nominal terms become easier to repay as the value of money declines. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. We haven't yet defined inflation formally. We haven't explained why it happens or how it's measured, or what role governments and central banks play in managing it. Those explanations will come slowly and in their own time. For now, we're simply establishing the foundation, the lived experience that underlies all the theory and policy. So let us continue in this vein for a bit longer. Let us think about other ways inflation manifests in daily life. Consider a restaurant you visited for years. The menu changes occasionally. New dishes appear, old favourites disappear. But the prices, if you've been paying attention, have trended upward. A meal that once cost $15 now costs $20. Not because the portion is larger or the ingredients finer, but simply because time has passed. And with time, prices have adjusted. Or consider services, a haircut, a plumber's visit, a doctor's appointment. These too become more expensive over time. The labour involved hasn't fundamentally changed. The skill required is much the same. But the price has risen, reflecting broader changes in the cost of living, in wages, in the general level of prices throughout the economy. Even small pleasures, a movie ticket, a paperback book, a cup of coffee at a cafe, cost more than they used to. These are not large expenses individually, but they add up, and more importantly, they serve as markers, little signposts that remind us of the passage of time and the changing value of money. Now, some of you may be wondering whether this is inevitable, whether prices must always rise, or whether there could be periods where they fall, or remain stable for long stretches. And the answer is that history contains all of these patterns. There have been times when prices fell, this is called deflation, and times when they remained relatively stable for years or even decades. But in the modern era, in most developed economies, inflation has been the norm. Prices tend to rise, slowly and steadily, year after year. Why this is the case, why modern economies seem to generate persistent inflation, is a question we'll explore later. For now, it's enough to recognize that this is the world we inhabit, a world where $1 today is expected to be worth slightly less tomorrow, and where planning for the future requires accounting for this gradual erosion of purchasing power. Children growing up today will find the prices of their childhood quaint when they reach adulthood. They will tell stories about how little things used to cost, and their own children will find those stories hard to believe, just as we find it hard to believe the prices our parents or grandparents recall. This is the nature of living in an inflationary world. The past seems cheaper, not because it was objectively cheaper, but because money was worth more, because each unit of currency commanded a larger share of the economy's goods and services. Yet, for all this talk of rising prices, life continues. People work, earn, save, spend. The economy functions. Goods are produced and consumed. Services are rendered and paid for. Inflation is present, persistent, but it does not, in most cases, disrupt the basic functioning of economic life. It is a background condition, a slow drift that people learn to navigate, to anticipate, to incorporate into their financial planning. This is not to minimize its effects. For people on fixed incomes, for retirees living on savings accumulated years ago, inflation can be a genuine hardship. The money they set aside when they were working buys less now, and there is no easy way to replenish it. For savers, inflation erodes the value of cash sitting in bank accounts, slowly but relentlessly reducing what that cash can purchase. These are real consequences, real challenges that real people face. For now, we're simply observing, simply noting the ways inflation appears in everyday life, the way it colors our economic experience without necessarily dominating it, the way it operates quietly, almost politely, shifting prices upward in small increments that rarely shock, but gradually accumulate into significant change. As you settle in, as your mind begins to wander or perhaps to rest, hold on to this basic idea. Prices rise. Money buys less over time. This has been true for most of your life, and it will likely remain true for the foreseeable future. It is neither catastrophic nor negligible. It is simply a feature of the economic landscape, like interest rates or taxes or any other element of the financial world we navigate. Now, having established this foundation, having grounded ourselves in the familiar experience of watching prices climb year after year, we can begin to ask more formal questions. What exactly is inflation? How do we measure it? Why does it happen? What can be done about it, if anything? These questions will unfold slowly, at a pace that allows for both understanding and rest, as we move deeper into the mechanics and history of this persistent economic phenomenon. Let us begin, then, with a definition. A simple one, stripped of jargon and complexity. Inflation is the rate at which the general level of prices for goods and services rises over time. When inflation occurs, each unit of currency buys fewer goods and services than it did before. The purchasing power of money declines. This definition is straightforward, almost obvious given what we've already discussed. But it's worth stating clearly, worth having as a reference point as we move forward. Inflation is not about one price rising, or even a few prices rising. It is about the overall level of prices, the average across the entire economy, moving upward. Immediately, this raises a question. How do we measure such a thing? How do we determine the general level of prices across an entire economy, with its millions of transactions, its countless goods and services, its regional variations and seasonal fluctuations? The answer is that we don't measure it perfectly. We approximate, we sample, we construct a representative basket of goods and services that a typical household might purchase, and we track how the cost of that basket changes over time. This basket is not arbitrary. It is carefully designed to reflect actual spending patterns. Economists and statisticians survey thousands of households, asking what they buy and how much they spend. The results are compiled, weighted and organized into categories: food and beverages, housing, transportation, medical care, recreation, education. Each category receives a weight based on how much of a typical household's budget it consumes. Then, month after month, year after year, researchers collect prices for the items in this basket. They visit grocery stores and record the cost of milk, eggs, bread, and produce. They track rent and mortgage costs. They note the price of gasoline, electricity, and heating oil. They monitor the cost of clothing, furniture, appliances, and vehicles. All of this data is gathered, compiled, and analyzed. The result is an index, a number that represents the overall price level at a given point in time. The most commonly used index in the United States is called the Consumer Price Index, often abbreviated as CPI. The CPI starts with a base period, a reference year against which all other years are compared. That base year is assigned a value of 100. If 5 years later the index stands at 110, that means prices have risen by 10% over that period. If it stands at 120, prices have risen by 20%. This index is published monthly. Economists, policymakers, journalists, and investors all pay attention to it. They watch for trends, for accelerations or decelerations in the rate of change. Because the rate of change, the speed at which the index is rising, is what we typically mean when we talk about inflation. If the CPI rises by 2% over the course of a year, we say inflation is running at 2%. If it rises by 5%, inflation is 5%. These percentages may seem small, abstract, disconnected from the everyday experience we discussed earlier, but they accumulate. 2% inflation, sustained over a decade, means that prices are roughly 22% higher than they were at the start. Over 2 decades, prices nearly double. Over 3 decades, they more than double. The effect is gradual but relentless, compounding year after year, eroding the purchasing power of money in a way that is easy to overlook in any given month, but impossible to ignore over longer periods. It's important to recognize that this index, this measurement, is imperfect. The basket of goods is updated periodically, but not continuously. Spending patterns change as new products emerge and old ones fade. The basket used today includes smartphones and streaming services, items that didn't exist a few decades ago. But it may not perfectly capture the latest shifts in consumer behavior. It may overweight some categories and underweight others, and it may not reflect the experience of every individual household. A young renter in a city faces different expenses than a retired homeowner in a rural area. The CPI attempts to capture a national average, but averages, by definition, obscure individual variation. There are also technical challenges. How do you account for improvements in quality? A car today is safer, more fuel efficient, and more reliable than a car from 30 years ago. If the price has risen, is that inflation, or is it simply the cost of better quality? Statisticians make adjustments, trying to isolate the pure price change from the quality change. But these adjustments are necessarily imperfect, based on assumptions and approximations. Despite these limitations, the CPI remains useful. It provides a consistent, standardized way to track price changes over time. It allows for comparisons across years and decades. It serves as a benchmark, a reference point that helps us understand whether prices are rising quickly or slowly, whether inflation is accelerating or moderating. It is not the only index. There are others, each designed to measure different aspects of price change. The Producer Price Index, for instance, tracks the prices that producers receive for their goods rather than the prices consumers pay. This can serve as an early indicator of inflation, since changes in producer prices often precede changes in consumer prices. There is also the GDP deflator, which measures price changes across the entire economy, not just consumer goods. And there are more specialized indices tracking specific sectors or regions. For our purposes, the CPI is sufficient. It is the most widely known and widely used measure of inflation, and it will serve as our guide as we explore the topic further. We have a definition, we have a measurement. Now we can ask, why does inflation happen? What causes the general level of prices to rise over time? This question has occupied economists for centuries, and the answers are varied, complex, and sometimes contentious. But we can sketch the broad outlines without getting lost in academic debates. At the most basic level, prices rise when demand for goods and services exceeds supply. Imagine a simple scenario. A town has one bakery, and the bakery produces 100 loaves of bread each day. On a typical day, people in the town want to buy 100 loaves, and the price is $2 per loaf. Everyone who wants bread gets bread, and the bakery sells out. Now imagine that something changes. Perhaps new families move to town, increasing the population. Or perhaps people's incomes rise and they decide to buy more bread. Suddenly, people want to buy 120 loaves, but the bakery still produces only 100. There is more demand than supply. What happens? The bakery could simply sell out earlier in the day, leaving some customers without bread. But if this happens repeatedly, the bakery owner might realize that people are willing to pay more. So the price rises to $2.50. At this higher price, some people decide to buy less bread or to buy it less often, and demand falls back to match the available supply. The market clears, but at a higher price. This is demand-driven inflation, too much demand chasing too little supply. It can happen in a single market, like our bakery, or across the entire economy. If people, in aggregate, want to buy more than the economy can produce, prices will rise. This can occur for various reasons. Perhaps the government has increased spending, putting more money into people's hands. Perhaps banks have made credit easier to obtain, allowing people to borrow and spend more. Perhaps consumer confidence has risen, and people are more willing to make large purchases. Whatever the cause, the result is the same. Demand exceeds supply, and prices adjust upward. But this is not the only way inflation can occur. There is also cost-driven inflation, sometimes called supply-side inflation. This happens when the cost of producing goods and services rises, and producers pass those higher costs onto consumers in the form of higher prices. Consider our bakery again. Suppose the price of flour increases. Perhaps there has been a drought, reducing the wheat harvest, and flour suppliers are charging more. The bakery's costs have risen. To maintain its profit margin, the bakery raises the price of bread. Customers now pay more, not because demand has increased, but because the underlying cost of production has increased. This can ripple through the economy. Higher energy costs, for instance, affect nearly every industry. If the price of oil rises, transportation becomes more expensive. Goods cost more to ship. Factories spend more on electricity and heating. These higher costs get passed along, and the general price level rises. Wages can also drive cost-push inflation. If workers demand higher wages and employers agree, the cost of labor rises. To cover these higher labor costs, businesses may raise prices. This can create a cycle where rising prices lead workers to demand higher wages, which leads to higher prices, which leads to further wage demands, and so on. This cycle, sometimes called a wage price spiral, has been a concern for policymakers in various periods of history. Inflation can be driven by demand or by costs or by some combination of the two. In practice, it is often difficult to disentangle these forces. An increase in energy prices might be considered cost-driven inflation, but if that increase is itself caused by rising global demand for energy, then the ultimate cause is demand. Similarly, rising wages might seem like a cost factor, but if wages are rising because workers are in high demand and employers are competing for labor, then again, demand is the underlying driver. What matters from a practical standpoint is that prices are rising, and understanding why they are rising can help guide policy responses. If inflation is driven by excessive demand, the solution might be to reduce demand, perhaps by raising interest rates, making borrowing more expensive, and thus discouraging spending. If inflation is driven by supply constraints, the solution might involve addressing those constraints, perhaps by increasing production, improving infrastructure, or removing regulatory barriers. But we are getting ahead of ourselves again. We have not yet discussed who manages inflation, or how they do so, or why they feel the need to manage it at all. These questions will come soon, in their own time. For now, it is enough to understand that inflation has causes, that it does not simply happen by accident or by some mysterious economic force, but arises from specific, identifiable changes in supply and demand. It is worth noting that inflation is not always bad. A little inflation, sustained over time, is generally considered normal, even healthy, in a growing economy. It signals that demand is robust, that people are willing to spend, that businesses are confident enough to raise prices. Central banks in most developed countries aim for a low, steady rate of inflation, typically around 2% per year. This target is not arbitrary. It provides a buffer against deflation, which can be more damaging than moderate inflation. It allows for smoother adjustments in wages and prices, and it encourages spending and investment, since people know that money sitting idle will gradually lose value. But high inflation, or rapidly accelerating inflation, is disruptive. It creates uncertainty. People do not know what prices will be in the future, which makes planning difficult. Businesses hesitate to invest. Savers see their wealth eroded. Fixed income earners like retirees struggle to keep up. And if inflation becomes extreme, reaching double digits or higher, it can undermine confidence in the currency itself, leading to economic instability. There is a balance to be struck. A little inflation is tolerable, even desirable. Too much inflation is problematic. And deflation, falling prices, brings its own set of challenges, which we will touch on later. For now, let us simply rest with this understanding. Inflation is measured. It has causes. It exists on a spectrum, from moderate and manageable to high and destabilizing, and it is, in most modern economies, a persistent feature of economic life, something to be monitored, managed, and occasionally corrected, but rarely eliminated entirely. The question of who manages inflation and how brings us to central banks. These institutions, present in nearly every country, occupy a peculiar position in the economic landscape. They are governmental in nature, but often operate with a degree of independence from elected officials. They do not produce goods or services. They do not employ large workforces or operate factories. Instead, they manage the money supply, set key interest rates, and attempt to maintain economic stability. In the United States, this role falls to the Federal Reserve, often simply called the Fed. In Europe, it is the European Central Bank. In the United Kingdom, the Bank of England. In Japan, the Bank of Japan. Each has its own structure, its own history, its own specific mandate. But they share a common set of tools and a common objective: to keep inflation moderate and stable. The primary tool central banks use is the interest rate, specifically the rate at which banks can borrow money from the central bank, or from each other, on a very short-term basis. This rate, often called the policy rate or the overnight rate, influences all other interest rates in the economy. When the central bank raises this rate, borrowing becomes more expensive throughout the system. Mortgages cost more, car loans cost more, business loans cost more, credit card rates rise. And when borrowing is more expensive, people and businesses tend to borrow less, spend less, and invest less. Demand in the economy decreases, and with lower demand, upward pressure on prices eases. Inflation slows. Conversely, when the central bank lowers interest rates, borrowing becomes cheaper. People are more willing to take out loans. Businesses are more willing to invest in expansion. Spending increases, demand rises, and with higher demand, prices may begin to climb more quickly. Inflation accelerates. This is the basic mechanism. Raise rates to cool the economy and reduce inflation. Lower rates to stimulate the economy and prevent deflation or stagnation. It sounds simple, almost mechanical, but in practice it is anything but. Central bankers must make decisions with incomplete information, trying to predict how the economy will respond to their actions months or even years in the future. They must balance competing concerns. If they raise rates too aggressively, they might push the economy into recession, causing unemployment to rise and output to contract. If they raise rates too timidly, inflation might spiral out of control, eroding purchasing power and destabilizing the economy in a different way. The decisions are made by committees, groups of economists and officials who meet regularly to review data, discuss conditions and vote on policy. These meetings are formal, structured, deliberate. The tone is measured, the language technical. Statements are released, press conferences are held, and markets around the world react, sometimes dramatically, to shifts in wording or emphasis. But beneath the formality lies uncertainty. No one knows with precision how the economy will behave. Models provide guidance, historical patterns offer clues, but the economy is vast, complex, and shaped by human behavior in ways that defy perfect prediction. Central bankers do their best, adjusting policy in response to incoming data, trying to steer the economy toward their target inflation rate, typically 2% as mentioned earlier, while avoiding recession and maintaining employment. This 2% target has become something of a convention, adopted by central banks across much of the developed world. It is low enough to avoid the problems associated with high inflation, but high enough to provide a cushion against deflation and to allow for flexibility in wage and price adjustments. It represents a consensus built over decades of experience and research about what constitutes a healthy inflation rate for a modern economy. Achieving this target requires patience and persistence. Inflation does not respond instantly to changes in interest rates. There are lags, delays between when a policy action is taken and when its effects become visible in the data. If the central bank raises rates in January, the full impact on inflation might not be apparent until June or September or even the following year. This makes the job of a central banker difficult. They must act based on forecasts and expectations, not just on current conditions. They must anticipate where the economy is headed, not merely respond to where it has been. Sometimes they get it wrong. Sometimes they raise rates too late, allowing inflation to build momentum. Sometimes they lower rates too slowly, prolonging a recession. The history of central banking is filled with mistakes. misjudgments, and lessons learned through painful experience. But it is also filled with successes, periods where inflation remained low and stable, where growth continued without overheating, where the system functioned smoothly, almost invisibly, allowing people to go about their lives without worrying too much about the value of their money. Beyond interest rates, central banks have other tools. They can buy or sell government bonds, injecting money into the economy or withdrawing it. This is called open market operations, and it affects the amount of money circulating in the financial system. More money generally means lower interest rates and easier credit. Less money means higher rates and tighter credit. During periods of crisis, central banks have employed even more unconventional measures, purchasing large quantities of assets, lending directly to struggling institutions, providing emergency liquidity to prevent financial collapse. These actions are controversial, debated among economists and policymakers, but they reflect the broad mandate central banks have to maintain stability. It is worth pausing to consider what the world would look like without central banks, without active management of inflation and interest rates. History provides examples. In the 19th century, before modern central banking became widespread, economies experienced violent swings. Periods of rapid inflation were followed by severe deflations. Financial panics were common. Banks failed regularly. The value of money could shift dramatically within a short span of time, creating chaos for savers, borrowers, and businesses alike. The establishment of central banks and the development of tools to manage inflation represented an attempt to smooth these swings to create a more predictable economic environment. It has not eliminated volatility entirely. Recessions still occur, financial crises still erupt, but it has reduced the frequency and severity of the wild fluctuations that characterized earlier eras. This brings us to the role of expectations. One of the more subtle aspects of inflation is that it depends in part on what people expect to happen. If workers expect prices to rise by 3% next year, they will demand wage increases of at least 3% to maintain their purchasing power. If businesses expect their costs to rise, they will preemptively raise their prices. These expectations can become self-fulfilling. If everyone expects inflation, they behave in ways that create inflation, even if the underlying economic conditions might not otherwise warrant it. Central banks pay close attention to inflation expectations. They conduct surveys asking businesses and consumers what they expect inflation to be in the coming months and years. They monitor financial markets, where inflation expectations are embedded in the prices of bonds and other securities, and they communicate carefully, trying to anchor expectations around their target rate. If people believe the central bank is committed to keeping inflation at 2%, and if they trust the central bank to follow through, then expectations will tend to cluster around 2%. This makes the central bank's job easier. Actual inflation will tend to gravitate toward the expected rate, reinforcing the target. But if credibility is lost, if people stop believing the central bank can or will control inflation, expectations can become unmoored. This is dangerous. Once people expect high inflation, it becomes much harder to bring it down. Wage demands rise, prices rise, and the central bank must take more drastic action, raising interest rates sharply, risking recession, to break the cycle. This has happened in various countries at various times, and the experience is almost always painful. The most famous example is probably the United States in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Inflation had been rising for years, reaching double digits. Previous central bank officials had tried to combat it, but their efforts were inconsistent, sometimes raising rates and then quickly reversing course when the economy weakened. People lost faith. They expected inflation to remain high, and it did. It took a determined effort by the Federal Reserve, under the leadership of Paul Volcker, to finally break the inflationary spiral. Interest rates were raised to extraordinarily high levels, above 15% at one point. The economy plunged into recession. Unemployment soared, but inflation came down. And once it did, the economy was able to recover on a more stable foundation. This episode taught central bankers around the world the importance of credibility, of making clear commitments and following through on them, even when it is politically difficult or economically painful in the short term. It also reinforced the idea that allowing inflation to become entrenched, to seep into expectations, is far more costly than preventing it from rising in the first place. Outside the actions of central banks, inflation is also influenced by broader economic forces, some of which are beyond any single institution's control. Global supply chains, for instance, play a significant role. Many of the goods we purchase are produced in other countries, shipped across oceans, and distributed through complex networks. Disruptions to these supply chains, whether from natural disasters, political conflicts, pandemics, or other shocks, can lead to shortages and price increases. A factory closure in one part of the world can ripple through to higher prices in another part months later. Energy prices, particularly oil, have historically been a major driver of inflation. Oil is used not just for transportation, but as an input in countless products, from plastics to fertilizers. When oil prices spike, the cost of producing and transporting goods rises across the board, leading to widespread price increases. Central banks have limited ability to counteract this kind of inflation. They can raise interest rates to dampen demand, but they cannot directly increase the supply of oil. All they can do is try to prevent the initial shock from spiraling into sustained, broad-based inflation. Demographics also matter. Aging populations, for instance, can affect inflation in complex ways. Older people tend to spend differently than younger people, and as the proportion of older people in a society rises, spending patterns shift. Labour markets are affected too. If the working age population shrinks, labour becomes scarcer, wages may rise, and cost-push inflation can result. Conversely, a growing workforce can ease wage pressures and help keep inflation in check. Technology, as mentioned earlier, often acts as a deflationary force. Automation reduces labour costs. Improved logistics reduce transportation costs. Better farming techniques increase crop yields. All of these developments tend to push prices down, or at least to restrain their growth. Over the past few decades, technological progress has likely held inflation lower than it would otherwise have been. Goods that once required extensive human labour to produce can now be made by machines. Information that once required expensive infrastructure to distribute can now be transmitted at essentially zero marginal cost over the internet. But technology is not uniformly deflationary. New technologies create new categories of spending. Smartphones, streaming services, cloud computing, these did not exist a generation ago, and now they represent significant portions of household budgets. As technology creates new desires and new markets, it also creates new avenues for spending and, potentially, new sources of inflation. All of these factors, central bank policy, supply chains, energy, demographics, technology, interact in ways that are difficult to predict or fully understand. Inflation at any given moment is the product of countless forces, some pulling prices up, some pushing them down, all operating simultaneously across a vast and interconnected global economy. What this means practically is that inflation is never fully under control. It can be managed, influenced, guided toward a target, but it cannot be eliminated or fixed at a precise level indefinitely. It fluctuates, responding to events both expected and unexpected, to policy decisions both wise and flawed, to shifts in human behavior and natural phenomena. Central banks do their best to smooth the fluctuations, to keep inflation within a tolerable range. But they are always reacting, always adjusting, always navigating uncertainty. For most people, most of the time, this management happens in the background. Interest rates change, policy statements are issued, but daily life continues largely unaffected, at least in the short term. It is only when inflation rises significantly, or when deflation threatens, that the broader public becomes acutely aware of these mechanisms and the institutions responsible for them. History offers perspective on these questions. The phenomenon of inflation is not new. It has existed in various forms for as long as money itself. In ancient Rome, emperors would sometimes debase the currency, reducing the precious metal content of coins while keeping their face value the same. This allowed the state to mint more coins from the same amount of silver or gold, effectively creating money out of thin air. But merchants were not fooled. They raised their prices to reflect the reduced value of the debased coins. Inflation followed. In medieval Europe, the discovery of new silver mines in Central Europe during the 15th century led to an increase in the money supply. More silver meant more coins, and more coins meant more money chasing the same quantity of goods. Prices rose gradually across the continent over several decades. This was inflation driven not by policy or economic mismanagement, but simply by an increase in the available supply of the monetary metal. The most dramatic example from this period came later, in the 16th century, when Spanish conquistadors brought vast quantities of gold and silver back from the Americas. The influx of precious metals into Europe was enormous. Spain, the primary recipient, experienced significant inflation. But the metals did not stay in Spain. They circulated throughout Europe, used to purchase goods, pay soldiers and finance wars. The result was a gradual but sustained rise in prices across the continent, a phenomenon historians refer to as the price revolution. Over the course of roughly a century, prices in many parts of Europe doubled or tripled. This may not sound dramatic by modern standards, but in a world where prices had been relatively stable for generations, it was profoundly disruptive. People at the time did not fully understand what was happening. The concept of inflation, as we understand it today, did not exist. There were debates about why prices were rising, but the connection between the influx of silver and gold and the rise in prices was not immediately obvious to most observers. It took time, and the development of economic thought for this relationship to be recognized and articulated. Moving forward through history, the 18th and 19th centuries saw their own episodes of inflation, often tied to war. Governments at war need resources, soldiers, weapons, supplies, and they need them quickly. But raising taxes is difficult, especially in the middle of a conflict. So governments often resort to printing money. During the American Revolutionary War, the Continental Congress issued paper currency to finance the war effort. Too much currency was printed and it lost value rapidly. The phrase, "not worth a continental," entered the language, referring to the nearly worthless paper money that had been issued. A similar pattern played out during the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. The French government issued paper money called assignats, backed initially by confiscated church lands. But as the government's need for funds grew, more and more assignats were printed, far beyond what the underlying assets could support. Inflation soared, and eventually the assignats became worthless. These episodes illustrate a recurring theme. When governments need money and cannot or will not raise it through taxation or borrowing, they create it. And when money is created faster than the economy's capacity to produce goods and services, inflation results. This is sometimes called monetary inflation, the idea that inflation is fundamentally a monetary phenomenon, caused by an excessive increase in the money supply. This view was most clearly articulated by the economist Milton Friedman, who famously stated that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. By this, he meant that sustained inflation cannot occur without an increase in the money supply. If the money supply is held constant, prices might fluctuate in response to temporary shocks, but they cannot trend upward indefinitely. Only when more money is created can sustained inflation take hold. This perspective has been influential, particularly among central bankers. It underlies the focus on controlling the money supply and managing interest rates. If inflation is fundamentally about too much money chasing too few goods, then the solution is to control the creation of money, to ensure that it grows at a pace consistent with the economy's ability to produce. But not all economists agree entirely with this view. Some emphasize the role of demand and supply imbalances, as discussed earlier, arguing that inflation can arise from factors beyond the money supply. Others point to structural issues, to bottlenecks and inefficiencies that can cause prices to rise, even when monetary policy is prudent. The debate continues, nuanced and technical, playing out in academic journals and policy discussions. What is clear from history is that extreme inflation, often called hyperinflation, is almost always associated with a collapse in the value of money. The most famous case is probably Germany in the early 1920s. Following World War I, Germany faced enormous reparations payments demanded by the victorious Allies. The government, unable to meet these obligations through normal taxation or borrowing, began printing money on a massive scale. The German mark, which had been a stable currency before the war, began to lose value. At first, the decline was gradual. Then it accelerated. By late 1923, prices were doubling every few days. Workers were paid multiple times a day and rushed to spend their wages immediately before the money lost more value. People carried wheelbarrows full of cash to buy basic groceries. Savings were wiped out. Anyone holding assets denominated in marks saw their wealth evaporate. The social and political consequences were profound, contributing to instability that would have lasting effects on German society. This episode has served as a cautionary tale ever since. Hyperinflation is devastating. It destroys trust in money, in institutions, in the social fabric itself. It is rare, requiring a combination of fiscal irresponsibility, political dysfunction, and often external shocks or pressures. But when it occurs, the damage is severe and long-lasting. Other examples exist. Zimbabwe in the late 2000s experienced hyperinflation, with prices doubling every day at the peak. The government had printed money to finance its spending, and the currency became worthless. Eventually, the country abandoned its own currency and began using foreign currencies like the US dollar and the South African rand. Venezuela in more recent years has faced similar problems, with inflation reaching extraordinarily high levels, causing widespread hardship and economic collapse. These are extreme cases, far removed from the experience of most developed economies in the modern era, but they illustrate what can happen when inflation is allowed to spiral out of control, when the mechanisms that normally constrain it, responsible fiscal policy, credible central banking, productive economic capacity, break down. The opposite of inflation, deflation, has its own historical examples and its own set of problems. Deflation occurs when the general price level falls over time. This might sound desirable. After all, who wouldn't want lower prices? But sustained deflation can be deeply harmful. When prices are falling, consumers and businesses have an incentive to delay purchases. Why buy today when the same item will be cheaper tomorrow? This reduction in spending can lead to lower demand, which leads to lower production, which leads to job losses, which leads to even lower demand. The economy can enter a downward spiral. Japan experienced this in the 1990s and 2000s. Following the bursting of a massive asset bubble in the early 90s, the Japanese economy entered a prolonged period of stagnation. Prices fell, slowly but persistently. The Bank of Japan lowered interest rates to nearly zero, trying to stimulate the economy, but even zero rates were not enough. People and businesses were reluctant to borrow and spend. The economy grew very slowly, if at all, for more than a decade. This period, often called Japan's lost decade, demonstrated how difficult deflation can be to escape once it takes hold. The Great Depression of the 1930s provides another example. In the United States and much of the world, prices fell sharply following the stock market crash of 1929. Banks failed, businesses closed, unemployment soared, and demand collapsed. The Federal Reserve, still relatively new at the time and not yet fully understanding its role, failed to provide adequate support. The money supply contracted, credit dried up, and deflation deepened. It took years and eventually the massive government spending associated with World War II to fully pull the economy out of the Depression. These historical episodes, the inflations and deflations, the hyperinflations and stagnations, have shaped modern economic policy. Central banks aim to avoid both extremes, targeting a low positive rate of inflation that provides stability without the risks associated with either deflation or high inflation. The 2% target, adopted widely, reflects this goal. It is high enough to avoid deflation, low enough to avoid the distortions and uncertainties that come with higher inflation. Between these extremes lies the more common experience of moderate inflation, the kind that has characterized most developed economies over the past few decades. Prices rise slowly, predictably in line with central bank targets. Workers receive modest wage increases that roughly keep pace with inflation. Savers earn interest that, after accounting for inflation, provides a small positive return. Borrowers repay loans in money that is slightly less valuable than the money they borrowed, making debt easier to service over time. This environment, stable and predictable, allows for economic planning. Businesses can invest with some confidence that the value of money will not shift dramatically. Individuals can save for retirement knowing that their savings will not be wiped out by runaway inflation or trapped in deflation. The economy can grow, productivity can improve, and living standards can rise, all within a framework of monetary stability. Of course, even in this stable environment, there are winners and losers from inflation. Debtors benefit, as mentioned, because they repay loans in less valuable money. Creditors lose, for the same reason. Owners of real assets, real estate, stocks, commodities, often see the nominal value of their holdings rise with inflation, though whether they are truly better off depends on how much inflation erodes the purchasing power of any income those assets generate. Wage earners face a more complex situation. If wages rise in line with inflation, purchasing power is maintained. But if wages lag behind inflation, even by a small amount, real income declines and living standards fall. These distributional effects are one reason inflation remains a topic of political debate. Different groups have different interests when it comes to inflation. Borrowers might prefer slightly higher inflation, which makes their debts easier to repay. Savers might prefer lower inflation, or even mild deflation, which preserves the value of their cash. Workers want wages that keep pace with or exceed inflation. Employers may resist wage increases that exceed productivity growth. These tensions play out in labour negotiations, in political campaigns, in policy discussions. Central banks tasked with managing inflation must navigate these competing interests. They cannot please everyone. Their goal is not to favour one group over another, but to maintain overall stability, to keep inflation low and predictable so that the economy can function smoothly. This requires technical expertise, careful judgment, and a willingness to make unpopular decisions when necessary. The tools and frameworks central banks use have evolved over time. Early central banks had limited tools and often limited understanding of how those tools worked. Over the course of the 20th century, as economic theory developed and data collection improved, central banking became more sophisticated. Models were built to predict how changes in interest rates would affect inflation and employment. Communication strategies were refined to manage expectations. International cooperation increased as central bankers recognized that economies are interconnected and that actions taken in one country can have spillover effects in others. Today, central banking is a highly technical field, drawing on mathematics, statistics, and economic theory. Yet it remains at its core an exercise in judgment under uncertainty. The models provide guidance, but they are not perfect. The data are always backward-looking, telling us where the economy has been, not where it is going. Central bankers must make decisions based on incomplete information, knowing that the consequences will unfold over months and years, and that those consequences will be scrutinized, criticized, and debated. The mechanisms by which central banks influence inflation operate through what economists call the transmission mechanism. When a central bank changes its policy rate, that change does not directly affect the prices consumers pay at the grocery store or the rent they pay each month. Instead, it sets off a chain of effects that ripple through the financial system and into the broader economy. First, the change in the policy rate affects other interest rates. Banks adjust the rates they charge on loans and the rates they pay on deposits. Mortgage rates move up or down. Corporate bond yields shift. The cost of financing a car purchase changes. All of these adjustments happen relatively quickly, within days or weeks of the policy change. Next, these interest rate changes affect behavior. Higher borrowing costs discourage taking out loans. Businesses postpone expansion plans. Consumers delay major purchases like homes and vehicles. Conversely, lower rates encourage borrowing and spending. A business that was on the fence about building a new facility might proceed when financing becomes cheaper. A family that was renting might decide to buy a home when mortgage rates fall. These changes in spending affect demand for goods and services. Higher demand puts upward pressure on prices. Lower demand eases that pressure. But this effect takes time to materialize. A business that postpones expansion today does not immediately reduce its demand for materials and labor. A family that decides to buy a home does not complete the purchase overnight. The process unfolds over months. Eventually, changes in demand filter through to prices. If demand is strong and businesses are operating near full capacity, they have more ability to raise prices. If demand is weak and excess capacity exists, competitive pressure keeps prices in check or even pushes them down. This final step from changes in demand to changes in inflation can take a year or more to fully play out. Throughout this entire process, expectations matter. If businesses and consumers believe the central bank is committed to controlling inflation, they will adjust their behavior accordingly. If they doubt the central bank's resolve, they may act in ways that undermine the policy. This is why communication is so important. Central banks issue statements explaining their decisions. Officials give speeches and interviews. They publish forecasts and analyses. All of this is aimed at shaping expectations, at convincing the public that the central bank knows what it is doing and will do what is necessary to maintain stability. Financial markets play a role in this transmission as well. Bond markets, stock markets, and currency markets all react to central bank decisions, sometimes dramatically. These reactions can reinforce or complicate the central bank's efforts. If markets believe a rate increase is coming and adjust in advance, the central bank's actual decision may have less impact than it otherwise would. If markets are surprised by a decision, the reaction can be more pronounced, amplifying the effect on the economy. Exchange rates add another layer of complexity. When a central bank raises interest rates, the currency often strengthens. Higher rates attract foreign capital seeking better returns, and this demand for the currency pushes its value up. A stronger currency makes imports cheaper, which can help reduce inflation by lowering the cost of foreign goods. But it also makes exports more expensive, which can hurt domestic producers who sell abroad. The net effect on inflation depends on the relative importance of imports and exports in the economy. All of these channels, interest rates, spending, demand, prices, expectations, financial markets, exchange rates, interact in ways that are difficult to predict precisely. Central bankers use models to estimate the effects of their policies, but the models are simplifications of a vastly complex reality. Real economies are shaped by human psychology, by political events, by technological change, by weather patterns affecting agricultural output, by countless factors that no model can fully capture. This uncertainty is one reason central banks tend to move cautiously, adjusting rates in small increments and waiting to see the effects before taking further action. Large, sudden changes can be disruptive, causing volatility in markets and uncertainty in planning. Gradual adjustments allow the economy to adapt, allow businesses and consumers to respond without panic or confusion. There are times, of course, when caution is not possible. During a financial crisis, when banks are failing and credit is freezing, central banks may need to act aggressively, cutting rates sharply and flooding the system with liquidity to prevent collapse. During periods of runaway inflation, they may need to raise rates steeply, accepting the pain of recession to break the inflationary spiral. But these are exceptional circumstances. Most of the time, central banking is a patient, deliberate process of small adjustments and careful observation. Beyond the technical mechanics, there are philosophical questions about the role of central banks and the nature of inflation itself. Some argue that central banks have too much power, that unelected officials should not have such broad influence over the economy. Others argue that central bank independence is essential, that insulating monetary policy from short-term political pressures allows for better long-term outcomes. This debate touches on fundamental questions about democracy, expertise, and the appropriate division of authority in modern societies. There is also debate about what central banks should target. Most focus on consumer price inflation as measured by indices like the CPI. But some argue that asset prices, stocks, real estate, bonds should also be considered. Asset price inflation can create bubbles, and when those bubbles burst, the economic damage can be severe, as the financial crisis of 2008 demonstrated. Yet, incorporating asset prices into the central bank's mandate raises difficult questions. Which assets should be targeted? How should they be weighted? How can a central bank distinguish between a bubble and a justified increase in asset values driven by fundamentals? These are not easy questions, and there are no universally accepted answers. Different central banks have taken different approaches shaped by their specific mandates, their institutional cultures, and the economic conditions they face. The Federal Reserve, for instance, has a dual mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices. The European Central Bank focuses primarily on price stability. The Bank of Japan has grappled with deflation for decades and has experimented with unconventional policies to stimulate inflation. Each operates within its own context, facing its own challenges. The global dimension of inflation adds yet another layer of complexity. Economies are interconnected through trade, finance, and supply chains. Inflation in one country can spill over into others. A spike in oil prices, caused perhaps by geopolitical tensions in the Middle East, affects inflation globally, not just in the countries where oil is produced or consumed. A surge in demand from a large economy like China can drive up prices for commodities worldwide. Central banks in small open economies must contend with inflationary pressures that originate abroad and over which they have little control. International coordination among central banks can help address these challenges. During the financial crisis, central banks around the world cut rates in a coordinated fashion, providing mutual support and amplifying the impact of their actions. They established currency swap lines, allowing each other to borrow foreign currency to support their banking systems. These cooperative efforts demonstrated that in an interconnected world, isolated action is often insufficient. Yet, coordination has limits. Each country has its own economic conditions, its own inflation dynamics, its own political constraints. What is appropriate policy for one may not be appropriate for another. A central bank in a country experiencing strong growth and rising inflation may need to raise rates, even as a central bank in a country facing recession and deflation is cutting rates. There is no single global monetary policy, only a collection of national policies that sometimes align and sometimes diverge. The question of what constitutes acceptable inflation is not static. The 2% target, now common among many central banks, was not always the norm. In earlier periods, some central banks aimed for zero inflation or even deflation, believing that stable or falling prices were ideal. Experience, particularly the deflationary episodes of the 20th century, led to a shift in thinking. A small positive rate of inflation came to be seen as preferable, providing a buffer against deflation and allowing for more flexible adjustment of wages and prices. But even within the 2% framework, there is room for interpretation. Is 2% an average to be achieved over time, allowing for periods above and below the target? Or is it a ceiling not to be exceeded? Different central banks answer these questions differently, and their answers shape how aggressively they respond to deviations from the target. Inflation also intersects with other policy goals. Full employment, for instance, is often in tension with low inflation. When unemployment is very low, workers have more bargaining power, and wages tend to rise. Rising wages can lead to higher production costs, which businesses pass on as higher prices. This is the wage price spiral mentioned earlier. Central banks must balance the goal of low inflation with the goal of high employment, recognizing that pushing unemployment too low can spark inflation, while allowing unemployment to rise too high can cause unnecessary hardship. The relationship between unemployment and inflation is captured in what is known as the Phillips curve, named after the economist who first observed an inverse relationship between the two. When unemployment is low, inflation tends to be high. When unemployment is high, inflation tends to be low. This relationship held fairly well through much of the mid-20th century, but it has become less reliable in recent decades. There have been periods of low unemployment with low inflation and periods of high unemployment with high inflation, challenging the simple inverse relationship. Economists have offered various explanations for this breakdown. Globalization may have increased competition, keeping prices in check even when domestic labor markets are tight. Changes in the structure of the economy, such as the shift from manufacturing to services, may have altered inflation dynamics. Better central bank credibility may have anchored expectations so firmly that inflation remains stable even as unemployment fluctuates. Whatever the reasons, the Phillips curve is now understood as a rough guide rather than an iron law. One more factor for central banks to consider, but not the sole determinant of policy. The tools available to central banks have evolved in response to changing economic conditions. When interest rates reached zero during the financial crisis and the subsequent recovery, central banks found themselves constrained. They could not lower rates further using conventional tools. So they turned to unconventional measures such as quantitative easing, which involves purchasing large quantities of government bonds and other assets. These purchases inject money into the financial system, lower long-term interest rates and support asset prices, all with the aim of stimulating economic activity and preventing deflation. Quantitative easing was controversial. Critics worried it would lead to runaway inflation, that creating so much money would inevitably debase the currency. But in practice, inflation remained subdued. The money created through quantitative easing mostly stayed within the financial system, held as reserves by banks, rather than flowing into the broader economy in ways that would drive up prices. This outcome surprised some observers and led to further debate about the relationship between money creation and inflation. Another unconventional tool is forward guidance, where central banks communicate their intentions about future policy. By signaling that rates will remain low for an extended period, central banks aim to influence expectations and encourage spending and investment. This tool relies entirely on credibility. If people believe the central bank's statements, forward guidance can be effective. If they doubt those statements, the tool loses its power. Negative interest rates have also been employed in some countries. The idea is that by charging banks to hold reserves, central banks encourage them to lend money rather than hoard it. Negative rates are unusual, counterintuitive, and their effectiveness is debated. They create challenges for savers and for the banking system itself. Yet they represent another example of central banks adapting their toolkit to address unprecedented economic conditions. The experience of recent decades has shown that inflation is not an inevitable consequence of monetary expansion, at least not in the short term. Large-scale money creation during the financial crisis did not lead to the inflation some feared. This has prompted reconsideration of old theories and development of new ones. Modern monetary theory, for instance, argues that governments that issue their own currency can spend freely without worrying about inflation, as long as the economy has unused capacity. This view is controversial, rejected by many mainstream economists, but it reflects ongoing efforts to understand the relationship between money, government spending and inflation in a world that has changed significantly from the one in which earlier theories were developed. The practical challenge for policymakers is that economic conditions can shift rapidly, and the tools available to respond have both strengths and limitations. Interest rates are powerful but slow-acting. Quantitative easing can provide support when rates hit zero, but carries risks if unwound too quickly. Forward guidance depends on credibility that can be damaged by errors or reversals. Negative rates may work in some contexts but not others. Each tool must be used judiciously, with careful attention to context and likely consequences. Throughout all of this, the goal remains the same: maintain inflation at a low, stable, predictable level. Allow the economy to grow and adapt without the distortions that come from rapidly rising or falling prices. Support employment and output while avoiding the excesses that lead to instability. These goals sound simple, but achieving them requires constant vigilance, technical expertise, and a willingness to adapt as conditions change. As we near the end of this exploration, it is worth reflecting on what inflation means in the context of daily life, beyond the statistics and the policy frameworks. For most people, inflation is not an abstract economic concept, but a lived reality, something experienced through the gradual accumulation of small changes. The price of bread rises by a few cents. Rent increases by $50 a month. The cost of a new car is a few $1,000s more than it was a few years ago. Each change is small, manageable, easy to absorb, but over years and decades they add up. This cumulative effect shapes financial planning. Saving for retirement requires accounting for the fact that the money saved today will buy less in the future. A nest egg that seems adequate based on current prices may prove insufficient if inflation erodes its purchasing power over 20 or 30 years. This is why financial advisors emphasize the importance of investments that can outpace inflation. Stocks, real estate, assets whose values tend to rise along with the general price level. It also affects decisions about debt. Taking on a mortgage to buy a home means committing to decades of monthly payments. But those payments, fixed in nominal terms, become easier to manage over time as wages rise with inflation. What feels like a significant financial burden in the early years of the mortgage becomes more manageable later, as the value of money declines and incomes increase. This dynamic has made home ownership accessible to millions of people who might not have been able to afford it in a world without inflation. For governments, inflation has fiscal implications. Tax revenues tend to rise with inflation, as higher nominal incomes push people into higher tax brackets, and as sales taxes apply to higher prices. But government obligations such as pensions and entitlements also tend to rise, often explicitly indexed to inflation. The net effect on government budgets depends on the specific structure of taxes and spending, but inflation generally makes it easier for governments to manage debt, since they can repay borrowed money in currency that has lost value. The distributional consequences of inflation are complex and often unequal. Those with financial assets that appreciate with inflation, stocks, real estate, commodities, tend to fare better than those whose wealth is held in cash or fixed income securities. Wage earners whose pay keeps pace with inflation maintain their standard of living, while those on fixed incomes or whose wages lag behind see their purchasing power decline. These disparities can exacerbate inequality, creating winners and losers not through differences in productivity or merit, but through the mechanics of how inflation affects different forms of wealth and income. There is also a generational dimension. Younger people, often carrying student debt or saving for a first home, may benefit from moderate inflation as it erodes the real value of their debts and makes it easier to accumulate wealth over time. Older people, particularly retirees living on fixed pensions or drawing down savings, may suffer as inflation diminishes what their money can buy. These tensions play out in political debates about economic policy, with different age cohorts having different preferences about how aggressive central banks should be in controlling inflation. Looking forward, the challenges facing central banks and policymakers are likely to evolve. Climate change, for instance, may introduce new sources of inflation as extreme weather disrupts agricultural production and damages infrastructure. The transition to renewable energy may create short-term price pressures as economies shift away from fossil fuels. Demographic changes with aging populations in many developed countries may alter labour markets and consumption patterns in ways that affect inflation dynamics. Technological change, particularly in artificial intelligence and automation, may continue to exert deflationary pressure on some goods and services while creating new categories of spending. The institutions and frameworks currently in place were developed in response to the experiences of the 20th century, the Great Depression, the stagflation of the 1970s, the financial crisis of 2008. They have proven reasonably effective at maintaining low and stable inflation in normal times. But whether they will be adequate for the challenges of the 21st century remains to be seen. Central banks continue to adapt, learning from experience, refining their tools, and adjusting their strategies as new challenges emerge. For now, inflation remains what it has been for most of the past few decades, a persistent low-level presence in economic life. Prices rise slowly, year after year, in ways that are predictable enough to plan around but noticeable enough to matter. Central banks monitor the data, adjust their policies, and communicate their intentions. Households and businesses adapt, making decisions about spending, saving, and investing with the expectation that money will continue to lose value gradually over time. This is the world we inhabit. Not a world of dramatic crises or catastrophic inflations, but a world of steady, manageable change. A world where $1 today is worth slightly less than $1 yesterday, and where $1 tomorrow will be worth slightly less than $1 today. It is a world shaped by institutions, by policies, by the accumulated wisdom of economists and central bankers who have studied the problem of inflation for generations. And it is a world that, for all its imperfections, allows for planning, for growth, for the gradual accumulation of wealth and the steady improvement of living standards. As you settle into rest, as your thoughts drift towards sleep, perhaps you carry with you a deeper sense of this quiet force that shapes the economy. Inflation is not urgent. It is not dramatic. It is simply there, moving through the background of daily life, shifting the numbers on price tags and paychecks, altering the relationship between money and the things money can buy. It has always been there, in one form or another, for as long as money has existed, and it will likely remain a permanent feature of the economic landscape, managed and monitored, but never entirely eliminated. And so our exploration comes to a close. We have moved from the familiar experience of watching prices rise to the formal definitions and measurements, from the mechanisms of central banking to the historical episodes that shaped our understanding, from the technical debates among economists to the practical implications for households and governments. Through it all, the theme has been the same. Inflation is persistent, gradual, and manageable. It requires attention, but not alarm. It shapes our world, but does not dominate it. Thank you for spending this time here, in this quiet corner where economics meets rest. If you found value in this gentle exploration, please consider subscribing, commenting below, and sharing this channel with others who might appreciate it. May you find the peace and rest you seek. Sweet dreams and good night.